If you are chosen to ask a question, please just state your name and your affiliation. That would certainly help us enormously. Can I ask a question? And it's really about tax reform. And Michael and Laura, these are two really big economic as well as political issues. What's happened to the Turnbull government with the political capital which they've had when it comes to tax reform, and particularly we've talked about negative gearing and GST and so forth? And it does seem like they don't really want to use that political capital, certainly Malcolm Turnbull. Is it because whatever tax reform happens, we're going to have to pay more tax?
Certainly I think politics has got in the way of tax reform, as it often does. What we've discovered in the past, the only way you can get sort of serious tax reform done in Australia is to overcompensate all the losers, and that's just very difficult to achieve at a time when government revenues are under a lot of pressure, and of course some of the longer run pressures on the budget on the spending side that we've talked about endlessly, but which are always sort of far enough up front that we didn't have to worry about them too much right now, are in fact catching up with us. So the medium term eventually becomes the near term, and that's the problem we're facing now. So we've kind of got squeezed from both directions, and it just makes it difficult to do those sort of big changes that people would like to see, I think.
Laura?
I think there are political considerations, but I think there are also policy considerations, which are that the question is, what are you trying to achieve? Now, the Business Council will say, well, we want to cut company tax rates and the world will be a much better place. But the Prime Minister, I quoted as telling colleagues a few weeks ago that the idea that you'd raise the GST to cut company tax rates is the go into the study, get out your service revolver and shoot yourself in the head political option. And I think he's probably got a point. The idea that you would go out and say we're going to raise a tax that will mainly hit lower income earners to pay for a rate cut on companies who are widely perceived, even if unfairly perceived, to be minimising tax isn't a real political goer. So there is that issue. So the question is, what are you trying to achieve in tax reform? And I think the issue is obviously a more efficient tax system. As Michael alluded to, the cost of compensation, largely thanks to a lot of the measures that John Howard introduced in post his own very good tax reforms, have made the cost of that very prohibitive. It's increased the churn factor. And when you've got the states not on board on a GST rise, despite some positive noises from New South Wales and South Australia, it becomes a little bit unclear what you can achieve other than reducing personal income tax rates. And that's now become the focus of tax reform, if you like, and the driver of looking for methods of doing that, which is in itself generated the issues of negative gearing and superannuation, as much as questions about superannuation concessions themselves.
From the floor, questions? Yes.
A question for Laura about the ability of the political system to deal with some of these long-term structural issues. Just reflecting on your recent writings about political amnesia and the sidelining of public service advice and the rise of short-termism and the dominance of the advisor class, which is a recent thing, it's gone back 30 plus years. Have you seen any change with Malcolm Turnbull and Martin Parkinson to re-empower the public service to give frank and fearless advice, or are we really still stuck in the same short-term political reactionary mode we've been in for the last 30 years?
I'd love Nigel to answer this question.
Just look at Nigel as well.
Sorry.
He asked you, Laura.
Yeah. Look, I've got to say my picture of the Malcolm and Martin world is a little bit sketchy still, but I think a couple of observations that are worth making. A lot of people around the executive wing of Parliament House will say to you, well, we couldn't really get going on tax till Martin arrived. And I think there seems to be quite an interesting sort of grouping of people now working on tax, probably in Treasury as well, but also out of PM&C. Arthur Sinodinos, who obviously is Cabinet Secretary, but also a former Treasury officer. I think the Prime Minister's office is relying very heavily on them. I think one of the things that remains a little bit perplexing and hard to read is the relationship between the Prime Minister and the Treasurer, and whether they're coordinating, whether their offices are coordinating enough. The Treasurer has a very well-respected officer from Treasury heading up his office, but a lot of the other staff are seen as more political, who's inherited from Joe Hockey, and it's not entirely clear to me all the time that they're coordinating their messages as well as they might. So I think that Malcolm Turnbull has made a lot of the right noises and has sent out some really good signals on the public service, and so it's created a sort of a bit of a wild optimism in Canberra. And certainly he only, of course, took up his job in late January, so we're still sort of waiting to see how that all plays out. But certainly within PM&C there's been a repurposing of the way they've been approaching their work, and as far as I can tell, a changed relationship between the department and the Prime Minister's office, and it always starts, it's a good lead by example sort of process.
Nigel, did you want to say something?
No.
All right, just very quickly, just one more question. If anyone's got just a quick question. No? Oh, there we go. Fabio.
Quick one. China seems to be the kind of the key to the economic outlook in 2016. And there's three scenarios. I just want to hear your views on them. One is kind of the one I think Michael described, 6.5% growth, kind of soft landing, perhaps is a description. And I remind people that 5% growth is like they're growing one Australia every year, right? About that size. Second sort of is like harder landing, so 1997 Asian financial crisis. And the third one is an even harder landing, and that's perhaps sort of another global financial crisis. So I'm just thinking, if you could just in a few minutes just go over the likelihood of those scenarios.
Sure. Well, look, to put that 6.5% growth in China, and that's kind of the target they've announced for 2016, somewhere between 6.5% and 7%. Well, if they achieve that, that's going to make the same contribution to global growth, the same contribution to commodity demand, I guess, as those 10% plus figures that we used to regard as normal for China. So certainly 6.5%, I think, should be seen as a good number. Clearly, if they do worse than that, then Australia's prospects dim as well. And when we heard from Nigel that Australia is very important for us, and in fact more important for us than any other country. So we certainly did very well out of China on the way up, but equally it means that if something goes wrong on the downside, that we're going to suffer more than most as well. The probabilities, the hard landing or something worse, I think are actually quite low. I think people underappreciate the amount of policy stimulus that's already been applied in China. So, for example, interest rates in China right now are lower than they were in 2008, 2009, where the general perception was there was this kind of big bang policy boost coming through there. And the announcements we saw over the weekend about where they want to push policy this year are certainly further in an expansionary direction. Worst case, if something goes really wrong in China, then we've got a very effective shock absorber that's helped us in the past, and that is the Aussie dollar. So I would think you'd be looking at a much lower currency if in that sort of worst case scenario for China, and that's certainly helped us in the past in terms of buffering incomes and buffering economic growth as well.
Almost as an insurance policy. Nigel?
I think that the questions... So I don't think that the key to economic performance in 2016, 2017 is what happens for Australia is not what happens in China. I think it's what happens domestically. So it's decisions that Australian households and Australian businesses make. We need consumption growth to continue to grow more strongly. We need the savings ratio to come down. to achieve that, and we need at some point, we need Australian businesses to invest. That's the key to our future, rather than what happens in China. That said, I think China is China's more important for our income than it is for our GDP. I think that's what I was trying to say earlier, and I think it's, while you can see risks around it, but the central case is that the Chinese authorities will continue to manage their economy pretty well, and there's little reason to doubt that. The question is, at some, they have to manage a very, very difficult transition, and it's a transition that none of the rest of us have managed particularly well. One thing that you can be sure is they've learnt from all the mistakes we all made, and they'll make, to the extent that there are errors, they'll be their own, not things that we did. But the central case is that they'll continue to manage that transition over time.
Okay, thank you, Nigel. I'm going to have to wrap that up. I know we have to reset for lunch and so forth. Thank you very much for your contributions. And thank you very much indeed to Michael, Laura and Nigel for the very stimulating presentations. I'm sure there's plenty of questions I'll ask you over drinks a little bit later on. So thank you very much. Let's show our thanks.